The Deathworld Council convened only once every solar cycle, a gathering so exclusive that most civilizations in the galaxy would never know it existed. The council chamber itself floated in neutral space, a station constructed from materials that could withstand environments lethal to 99% of known species. Here, representatives from the galaxy's most dangerous worlds met to discuss matters that softer civilizations could not comprehend, questions of survival on planets where the very air was poison, where the native fauna evolved specifically to kill, where a single moment of weakness meant death. The members of this council were not diplomats in the traditional sense. They were survivors, warriors, beings who had clawed their way to sentience against odds that made other species' evolutionary paths look like leisurely strolls through paradise. The Kresh delegation arrived first, as they always did, their chitinous forms gleaming under the station's harsh lighting. The Kresh had evolved on a world where the atmosphere was thick with corrosive compounds, and the native predators could dissolve flesh with their saliva. They had learned to coat themselves in organic armor, to move in coordinated packs, to treat every shadow as a potential threat. Next came the VRYNN, massive reptilians from a high-gravity world where the plants themselves were carnivorous, and the smallest creatures could deliver venom that paralyzed beings 3 times their size. The VRYNN walked with the careful confidence of apex predators who had fought for that position against competition that would give other species nightmares. The TH-Call floated in next, encased in their environmental suits that protected them from the station's relatively benign atmosphere. Their homeworld existed in a state of perpetual volcanic activity, the surface constantly reshaping itself through tectonic violence that would shatter continents on gentler planets. The TH-Call had evolved in the deep caverns beneath that chaos, developing senses that could detect seismic shifts hours before they occurred, learning to build civilizations that could be abandoned and rebuilt within days when necessary. Each species represented in the council had similar stories, evolutionary histories written in blood and ash, and the bones of those who had not adapted quickly enough. For 3 centuries, the Deathworld Council had maintained its exclusive membership, adding new species only when indisputable evidence proved they had earned the right to sit among the galaxy's hardiest survivors. The criteria were absolute and unforgiving. A species must have evolved on a planet classified as Category 9 or higher on the Galactic Habitability Index, meaning a world where environmental factors created constant existential pressure on developing life. They must have achieved sentience and technological civilization without outside intervention, proving they could master their hostile environment through their own ingenuity. And perhaps most importantly, they must demonstrate the psychological resilience that came from generations of survival against overwhelming odds, a certain hardness of spirit that could not be faked or learned secondhand. Today's gathering had been called for an extraordinary purpose, one that had generated heated debate among the council members for months leading up to this moment. A petition for membership had been received from a species that met the technical criteria, but whose inclusion threatened to fundamentally alter the Council's understanding of what it meant to be a Deathworlder. The species called themselves humans, and they came from a planet designated Earth, a world that had been surveyed by galactic scouts 70 years prior and classified as a Category 12 Deathworld, among the most hostile environments known to support complex life. The survey data had been clear in its assessment. Any species that evolved as sentients on such a planet would be formidable survivors, assuming they did not drive themselves to extinction first. The Kresh Council leader, a scarred veteran named Thrix, who bore the marks of 1,000 battles against his homeworld's predators, called the session to order with a series of clicks that the translation system rendered into standard. The matter before them, he announced, required careful consideration because it involved not merely the admission of a new species, but the question of whether humanity's recent actions disqualified them from membership based on the Council's oldest and most sacred principle, that Deathworlders survived through strength and cunning, not through savagery that served no purpose beyond violence itself. The chamber fell silent at these words, every species present understanding the weight of what was being implied. The evidence was displayed on the chamber's central hologram, and even beings who had witnessed horrors that would break softer species felt their analogues to shock ripple through them. 3 human vessels hung in the projection, their hulls scorched and pitted from weapons fire, their running lights flickering with power fluctuations that suggested catastrophic damage to their systems. But it was not the damage to the ships themselves that drew the Council's attention, it was what covered them. Biological matter, frozen in the void of space, coated the human vessels in irregular patterns that spoke of close-quarters combat in vacuum. Analysis indicated the material was a mixture of human and non-human biology, crew members and boarders alike. Their remains splattered across the hulls in testimony to violence so intense it had breached the ship's integrity. The incident report told a story that seemed impossible even by Deathworld standards. A human colony fleet, 3 vessels carrying 20,000 civilians to establish a settlement in an unclaimed system, had been attacked by the Kalesh swarm. The Kalesh were not members of the Deathworld Council, they were something worse, a hive species from a world so hostile that individuality had been abandoned in favor of collective survival. They were raiders and parasites, using captured ships and stolen technology to prey on weaker species, and they had identified the human colony fleet as easy targets. The Kalesh had attacked with overwhelming numbers, boarding all 3 vessels simultaneously, intending to harvest the colonists for biological material and claim the ships for their swarm. What happened next had sent shockwaves through the galactic intelligence community and prompted the emergency council session. The humans had not surrendered despite facing impossible odds, they had not tried to negotiate or flee, and they had not died quickly as the Kalesh had expected. Instead, the colonists had fought back with a ferocity that the Kalesh, despite their own brutal origins, had been completely unprepared for. Using improvised weapons, emergency tools, and in many cases their own bodies as weapons, the humans had turned their colony ships into killing grounds. The battle had lasted 7 hours, and by the end, the Kalesh boarding parties had been completely annihilated. Not routed, not driven back to their ships, but utterly destroyed to the last individual. The cost to the humans had been devastating. 8,000 colonists dead, including many who had sacrificed themselves to protect others, who had used their own bodies to shield children or had detonated emergency systems knowing it would kill them along with the attackers. The survivors were traumatized, bearing physical and psychological wounds that would take years to heal. But they had survived, and more than that, they had sent a message that was now reverberating through the darker corners of galactic society. Humanity could be hurt, could be killed, but could not be taken. Any species that attacked human civilians needed to understand they were not choosing easy prey, they were choosing a fight to extinction. The human delegation had been kept waiting in an anteroom while the council reviewed the evidence, a calculated move designed to test their patience and observe how they handled the stress of uncertainty. Through concealed sensors, council members watched the 3 human representatives, studying their behavior for signs of the psychological traits that define true Deathworlders. The delegation leader was a woman named Captain Sarah Okonkwo, a veteran of Earth's Unified Defense Forces whose personnel file indicated she had been born in the Lagos Metroplex, one of Earth's megacities where billions lived in density that would trigger claustrophobic panic in most species. She sat with perfect stillness, her dark eyes focused on nothing in particular, displaying the patience of a predator that had learned to wait for the right moment to strike. Beside her sat Dr. James Chen, a xenobiologist who had survived the colony fleet attack by organizing the defense of the medical bay, holding that position for 3 hours against overwhelming Kalesh numbers using nothing but medical tools and environmental hazards. His hands bore the scars of that battle, chemical burns from improvised weapons, and his file indicated he had refused reconstructive treatment, choosing to keep the marks as reminders. The third member of the delegation was Ambassador Marcus Webb, a career diplomat whose psychological profile indicated he had been raised in the Australian outback, one of Earth's remaining wilderness zones where humans still tested themselves against their homeworld's native dangers. He reviewed his presentation notes, with the focused attention of someone who knew that words could be as important as weapons in certain contexts. The council members observed these humans with a mixture of curiosity and caution, noting details that spoke to their Deathworld origins. The way Okonkwo's eyes tracked movement in her peripheral vision, never quite relaxing her awareness of her surroundings despite being in theoretically safe territory. The way Chen's scarred hands remained loose and ready, positioned where they could react quickly to any threat. The way Webb maintained social distance from his colleagues, not from distrust but from an instinctive understanding that clustering made groups vulnerable to area attacks. These were subtle behaviors, unconscious adaptations that species from safer worlds never developed, and their presence confirmed what the survey data had already suggested. Earth had shaped these beings in fundamental ways that went beyond mere physical adaptation. When the council finally summoned the human delegation, they entered the chamber with a confidence that bordered on defiance, and several council members felt their threat assessment instincts activate in response. The humans were not large by galactic standards. Their bodies seemed almost fragile compared to the armored Kresh or the massive VRYNN, but they moved with an efficiency that suggested every gram of their mass had been optimized for survival. Okonkwo approached the speaker's platform without hesitation, her posture radiating a combination of respect for the council's authority and absolute certainty in her right to stand before them. She began her presentation not with pleasantries or diplomatic niceties, but with a simple statement of fact that cut through the formality like a blade through flesh. Humanity requested admission to the Deathworld Council because Earth met every criterion established in the Council's charter, and because recent events had proven beyond any doubt that humans possess the fundamental characteristics that define Deathworld species. She displayed Earth's environmental data on the chamber's holographic systems, and even beings who had reviewed the information previously felt renewed appreciation for the sheer hostility of the human homeworld. Earth's atmosphere contained oxygen at concentrations that would be considered toxic to most carbon-based life, creating an environment where materials oxidized rapidly and fires burned with terrifying intensity. The planet's surface was 70% covered in a solvent, water, that dissolved most substances and existed in 3 states simultaneously across different climate zones, creating weather patterns of staggering violence. The tectonic activity that the THCAL found notable about their own world was matched, and in some cases exceeded by Earth's continental drift, volcanic eruptions, and seismic events that regularly devastated human population centers. The planet's axial tilt created seasonal variations that forced life to adapt to temperature swings of 80 degrees Celsius or more in some regions, going from lethal heat to lethal cold in predictable cycles that nonetheless killed the unprepared with regularity. Earth's native megafauna had included predators that massed several tons and could run down prey across open ground, apex hunters that had shaped human evolution through millions of years of pressure that favored intelligence, endurance, and pack coordination over raw physical power. But Okonkwo did not dwell on Earth's environmental dangers, lethal as they were, because she understood that the Council needed to hear something more important. She displayed images from human history, evidence of how her species had responded to their hostile homeworld by becoming something unique in the galaxy. Humans had not merely adapted to Earth's dangers, they had conquered them, developing technologies and strategies that transformed every threat into a manageable problem. They had built cities in regions that experienced regular hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods, learning to construct structures that could withstand forces that would level settlements on gentler worlds. They had developed agriculture in environments that resisted cultivation, forcing the land to yield food through sheer persistence and ingenuity. And when their environment was not sufficiently challenging, when they had pushed back the immediate threats enough to create pockets of safety, humans had begun testing themselves in new ways. Okonkwo showed the council images that seemed to defy rational explanation, humans deliberately placing themselves in dangerous situations not for survival, but for what they called recreation. Climbing sheer rock faces without safety equipment, diving into the deepest parts of Earth's oceans where pressure would crush most species, jumping from aircraft for the thrill of free fall before deploying emergency chutes at the last possible moment. The xenopsychologist who had accompanied the VRYN delegation noted with fascination that humans appeared to require danger, to seek it out when their immediate environment became too safe, as though their evolution had hardwired them to expect constant threats. The presentation shifted to more recent history, humanity's emergence onto the galactic stage, and their rapid expansion into space. The council members noted that human colony sites were consistently chosen in locations that other species had surveyed and rejected as too hazardous for settlement. High radiation zones, extreme temperature variations, unstable geological activity, humans seemed to prefer worlds that tested them, that forced them to remain alert and adaptive. Several colonies had been established on planets that already possessed hostile native life, and rather than terraforming these worlds into safer versions of Earth, the humans had simply adapted their settlements to coexist with the dangers, treating them as acceptable background threats that kept their survival instincts sharp. It was this pattern of behavior that Okonkwo argued made humanity ideal candidates for council membership. Humans did not merely survive death worlds, they thrived on them. They needed the challenge that such environments provided to maintain the psychological edge that had carried them to sentience. And when threats emerged that could not be mitigated through technology or strategy, when violence became the only remaining option, humans demonstrated a capacity for controlled savagery that rivaled any species in the galaxy. She did not shy away from the incident that had prompted this emergency session, instead addressing it directly with a candor that seemed to catch some council members off guard. The holographic display shifted to show the interior of the colony's ships during the Kalesh attack, footage recovered from security systems that had somehow continued recording through the chaos. The council members watched in silence as the invasion unfolded, seeing through multiple camera angles how the Kalesh had breached the hull simultaneously, how their numbers had seemed overwhelming, how the initial human response had appeared to be panicked retreat. But Okonkwo narrated what was actually happening, explaining that what looked like panic was actually tactical withdrawal, colonists falling back to predetermined defensive positions, using the ship's architecture to funnel the attackers into kill zones where improvised weapons could be most effective. The footage showed humans fighting with whatever came to hand, wielding cutting torches like flamethrowers, using emergency bulkhead controls to crush attackers, venting atmosphere in sealed sections to suffocate Kalesh warriors, while human defenders wore emergency breathing equipment. But it was not the improvisation that disturbed the council members. Many Deathworld species could improvise weapons in crisis situations. It was the coordination, the way human defenders seemed to instinctively understand what their fellows were planning, moving in synchronized patterns that required no verbal communication, covering each other's vulnerabilities without being asked. This was pack hunting behavior elevated to a level that even species with hive mind advantages rarely achieved. Dr. Chen took over the presentation at this point, his clinical voice providing context that transformed the violence from senseless brutality into tactical necessity. He explained that humans had evolved as persistence hunters, and social cooperators, developing neural architecture that allowed them to predict allies' actions and enemies' movements with remarkable accuracy. The colonists aboard the ships had been civilians, not soldiers, but they had drawn upon instincts coded into human DNA across millions of years of hunting and being hunted. When the Kalesh had breached the ships, they had not encountered helpless victims. They had encountered 20,000 humans whose ancestors had survived by being more dangerous than the predators that stalked them. The most disturbing footage came from the final hour of the battle, when the Kalesh boarding parties had been reduced to isolated pockets, and the humans had begun systematic elimination of the remaining invaders. The council members watched human colonists clearing sections of the ships room by room, moving with military precision despite having no formal combat training, checking corners and sealing spaces, ensuring no Kalesh survived to threaten them again. There was no mercy in these actions, no attempts to capture or negotiate, just methodical extermination driven by the cold calculation that an enemy that attacked children deserved no quarter and could not be allowed to survive and threaten again. Ambassador Webb addressed the council directly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that this moment would define humanity's relationship with the broader Deathworld community for generations. He acknowledged that the footage was difficult to watch, that the violence seemed excessive by the standards of civilized behavior. But he asked the council to consider the context, to understand that the Kalesh had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had seen human colonists, civilians with families and children, beings traveling in slow, vulnerable ships, and they had assumed that such softness meant weakness. The Kalesh had learned, too late, that humans could be gentle without being weak, that they could build civilizations focused on art and science and exploration while retaining the capacity for absolute violence when survival demanded it. This duality, Webb argued, was the essence of what made humans true Deathworlders. They had not overcome Earth's challenges by becoming permanently hardened warriors, by abandoning gentleness or empathy or the social bonds that made civilization possible. Instead, they had learned to maintain both states simultaneously, to be protective of the vulnerable while being lethal to threats, to build beautiful things while retaining the ability to destroy what threatened those creations. Every human carried within them the descendant of prey animals that had decided to stop running and start fighting, that had climbed down from the trees and walked upright across savannas filled with predators, that had looked at the apex carnivores of their world and declared themselves the new dominant species through sheer audacity and cooperative intelligence. The Kresh Council leader interrupted at this point, his translated voice sharp with skepticism. The violence displayed in the footage went beyond survival instinct, he argued, crossing into territory that concerned the Council's founding principles. Deathworlders fought to survive, killed when necessary, but maintained control over their violent impulses. What the humans had done aboard those colony ships looked less like controlled defense and more like barely contained bloodlust, and the Council needed assurance that humanity's capacity for violence could be reliably channeled toward legitimate threats rather than erupting indiscriminately whenever humans felt challenged. Okonkwo's response was immediate and unflinching, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made hard decisions in impossible circumstances. She explained that every action taken by the colonists had been driven by tactical necessity and protective instinct, not by bloodlust or loss of control. The humans had fought with such intensity because the Kalesh had attacked vessels carrying children, had threatened the most vulnerable members of human society, and had triggered protective responses that ran deeper than conscious thought. In human psychology, threats to children activated ancient neural pathways that transformed normally peaceful individuals into implacable defenders, and the Kalesh had unknowingly activated those pathways in 20,000 humans simultaneously. But Okonkwo emphasized that this capacity for protective violence was not the same as uncontrolled savagery. When the battle ended, When the last Kalesh attacker had been eliminated, the human survivors had not continued their rampage or turned on each other. They had immediately reverted to rescue and recovery operations, treating the wounded, comforting the traumatized, beginning the process of psychological healing that all survivors would need. They had documented the battle, preserved evidence, and contacted authorities to report what had occurred, behaving exactly as civilized beings should after a defensive action. The violence had been terrible but bounded, activated by specific triggers, and deactivated once the threat was eliminated. The council members engaged in rapid consultation, speaking among themselves in their native languages, while translation systems struggled to keep pace. The VRYN delegation seemed impressed by humanity's demonstration of controlled aggression, recognizing in it the same calculated ferocity that had carried their own species to dominance on their hostile homeworld. The TH-Call were more cautious, concerned that humanity's psychological volatility might make them unpredictable allies. But it was the Kresh who ultimately vocalized the question that all council members were considering, the fundamental issue that would determine humanity's petition. Thrix, the Kresh council leader, stood to his full height, his chitinous form catching the harsh lighting as he formulated his challenge. The footage and testimony had demonstrated that humans possessed the capacity for violence that Deathworld origins demanded, he acknowledged, and their homeworld met every environmental criterion established in the Council's charter. But the Deathworld Council existed not merely to celebrate survival through brutality. It served a higher purpose that humanity needed to understand before being granted admission. The Council was a fellowship of species that had learned hard lessons through harsh experience, that had evolved not just physical resilience, but wisdom about when violence served survival, and when it simply perpetuated cycles of destruction that benefited no one. The question Thrix posed cut to the heart of what troubled several council members about the human petition. How could the council trust that humanity's capacity for violence, so graphically demonstrated in the colony ship incident, would be exercised with the restraint and judgment that Deathworld species needed to maintain? History was filled with powerful civilizations that had destroyed themselves through inability to control their own destructive capabilities, and the galaxy could not afford to welcome another such species into the community of its most dangerous inhabitants. The Kresh themselves had nearly driven their species to extinction through internal warfare before achieving the maturity necessary for spaceflight, and they saw troubling parallels in human history that suggested humanity might be following a similar path. Captain Okonkwo listened to this challenge with visible tension in her shoulders, understanding that her response would determine not just Earth's membership in the Council, but potentially humanity's standing in the broader galactic community. She took a moment to compose her thoughts, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of personal experience rather than diplomatic protocol. She told the Council about her own childhood in Lagos, growing up in a megacity where 30 million humans lived in density that would cause psychological breakdown in most species. She described learning from an early age to navigate crowds, to assess threats, to maintain awareness of her surroundings because relaxing that vigilance could mean becoming a victim of the urban predators that existed in every human population center. But she also described the other lessons Lagos had taught her, lessons about cooperation and mutual aid that balanced the constant vigilance. She told of neighbors who looked after each other's children, of strangers who would intervene to protect the vulnerable, of the unwritten codes that governed human society even in environments where formal authorities struggled to maintain order. Humans had learned through painful experience that survival required not just individual strength, but collective security, that protecting the weak served everyone's interests because today's protected child was tomorrow's protector of others. This understanding was woven into human culture at every level, from family units to international treaties, a recognition that violence must serve protective purposes rather than predatory ones. Dr. Chen supplemented Okonkwo's testimony with data from human history, displaying graphs and statistics that told a complex story about humanity's relationship with violence. He showed conflict rates across human history, demonstrating that while humans had certainly engaged in warfare throughout their development, the trend over time was toward decreasing violence as societies matured. Humans had learned, slowly and at terrible cost, to channel their aggressive instincts into competitive rather than destructive outlets, to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than combat when possible, to recognize that long-term survival required cooperation as much as competition. But Chen also acknowledged the dark chapters in human history, periods when those lessons had been forgotten and violence had spiraled out of control. He showed the Council evidence of human conflicts that had killed millions, weapons that could render entire regions uninhabitable, ideologies that had justified atrocities against fellow humans. He did not shy away from this history because he understood that the Council needed to see humanity's complete record, not a sanitized version that concealed the species' capacity for self-destruction. And then he explained what humans had learned from those dark periods, how each catastrophe had led to new international frameworks designed to prevent repetition, how each failure had inspired renewed commitment to the principles that made civilization possible. The turning point in Chen's presentation came when he displayed data from the century following humanity's development of nuclear weapons, devices capable of destroying all complex life on Earth. The Council members, many of whom had witnessed their own species near extinctions, watched with recognition as Chen described the decades of tension when human civilization had teetered on the edge of self-annihilation. But he emphasized what happened next, how humans had stepped back from that precipice, how they had developed treaties and safeguards and cultural taboos against the use of such weapons, how they had chosen survival over the satisfaction of defeating enemies. This, Chen argued, was the crucial test that proved humanity's maturity as a Deathworld species. Ambassador Webb concluded the human presentation by addressing directly the concern about whether humanity could be trusted to exercise violence with appropriate restraint. He pointed out that the colony ship incident, while brutal, had been entirely defensive in nature. The humans had not pursued the Kalesh back to their home territories, had not launched retaliatory strikes against Kalesh civilian populations, had not demanded territory or resources as compensation for their losses. They had simply defended themselves with overwhelming force, and then returned to their original mission of peaceful colonization. This pattern, Webb argued, defined humanity's approach to violence, reluctant to initiate conflict but absolutely committed to winning when attacked, then returning to peaceful pursuits once the threat was eliminated. Webb referenced other incidents in humanity's short galactic history, cases where humans had been provoked or insulted but had chosen diplomatic solutions over violent responses. He showed records of trade disputes where humans had accepted less favorable terms rather than risk military confrontation, territorial disagreements where humans had compromised despite having the military advantage, and cultural misunderstandings where humans had extended forgiveness rather than demanding retribution. These examples, he argued, demonstrated that humans understood the difference between necessary violence and pointless aggression, between defending themselves and becoming the predators they had evolved to escape. The Council members deliberated among themselves again, this time at greater length and with visible division in their body language. The VRYN delegation seemed convinced by the human arguments, recognizing in humanity's history a parallel to their own species' journey from violent origins to controlled civilization. The TH call remained uncertain, their concerns about human psychological volatility not fully addressed by the testimony. But it was the Kresh who held the deciding influence, and Thrix's final questions would determine the outcome of humanity's petition. Thrix approached the human delegation directly, abandoning the formal protocols that usually governed council proceedings, and the shift in atmosphere was palpable. The Kresh leader's chitinous body bore scars from hundreds of encounters with his homeworld's predators, each mark a lesson in survival that had been earned through blood and pain. He stood before Captain Okonkwo with an intensity that other species might have interpreted as hostility, but that she recognized as the assessment of one apex predator evaluating another. His translated voice carried a quality that the technology struggled to render, something between challenge and invitation, testing whether humans were truly ready for what Deathworld Council membership would demand of them. Thrix spoke of the Council's true purpose, the reason it existed beyond mere celebration of survival through brutality. The galaxy, he explained, contained countless species that had achieved civilization through violence, that carried within their evolutionary heritage the capacity for destruction that competition demanded. But most of these species had evolved on worlds gentle enough that they never fully tested those capacities, never pushed their violent potential to its absolute limits, because their environments did not require such extremes. They could afford mercy because mercy rarely cost survival, could afford restraint because restraint was rarely punished with extinction, could afford philosophical debates about the ethics of violence because those debates occurred in safe spaces protected by distance from actual threats. Deathworlders did not have that luxury, Thrix continued, and his words carried the weight of species memory, of generations that had learned this truth in the harshest possible ways. Species that evolved on Category 9 or higher worlds learned that violence was not an abstract moral question, but a practical necessity, that sometimes survival required actions that would horrify beings from gentler environments, that the universe did not care about idealistic principles when fangs were at your throat. But this understanding came with a terrible responsibility, because Deathworlders, who embraced violence without restraint, became monsters that the galaxy could not tolerate, threats to themselves and others that inevitably invited destruction from coalitions of lesser powers who recognized the existential danger they represented. The Deathworld Council existed to help member species navigate this razor's edge, Thrix explained, to provide a community of beings who understood what it meant to carry the capacity for terrible violence while maintaining the wisdom not to unleash it except when absolutely necessary. Council members shared knowledge about psychological conditioning that helped maintain control, about social structures that channeled aggression into productive rather than destructive outlets, about the warning signs that indicated when a species or individual was losing the battle against their own predatory instincts. Membership meant accepting responsibility not just for your own actions, but for helping fellow members maintain the balance that kept them from becoming the monsters their hostile homeworlds had trained them to be. The question Thrix posed to humanity was simple in its statement, but profound in its implications. If admitted to the Council, would humans be willing to accept guidance from species that had walked the path longer, that had made mistakes and learned from them, that understood the challenges humanity would face as they continued to grow into their role as a galactic power? Would they be willing to share their own hard-won knowledge with other members, to help species that might be struggling with the same balance between necessary violence and destructive excess? Would they understand that Council membership was not a prize to be won, but a burden to be shared, a commitment to help maintain standards that protected both Deathworlders and the broader galaxy from the worst potentials that hostile worlds could create? Captain Okonkwo's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying absolute conviction that seemed to resonate with something in Thrix's own experience. She stated that humanity had spent its entire history learning to balance its capacity for violence with its need for civilization, had fought countless internal battles between those who wanted to embrace their predatory heritage and those who wanted to transcend it, and had emerged with the understanding that both impulses served necessary functions when properly channeled. Humans would welcome guidance from species that had faced similar challenges, would share their own lessons learned through terrible cost, would commit themselves to the responsibility that council membership entailed because they understood that power without wisdom led only to destruction. She spoke of human culture's greatest heroes, figures who were celebrated not for violence itself but for the wisdom to use violence only when necessary, and the strength to show mercy when possible. She described the warrior traditions that existed in every human culture, systems of combat training that emphasized discipline and restraint as much as effectiveness, that taught fighters to protect the weak rather than prey upon them, that honored the defeated rather than desecrating them. These traditions, Okonkwo argued, represented humanity's collective effort to maintain the balance that Thrix had described, cultural technologies developed across thousands of years to ensure that violence served protective rather than predatory purposes. Dr. Chen added scientific context to Okonkwo's testimony, explaining the neurological and psychological mechanisms that humans had developed to control their aggressive impulses. He described the prefrontal cortex development that allowed humans to override instinctive responses, the social conditioning that created internalized restraints against inappropriate violence, the ethical frameworks that provided guidelines for when force was justified and when it crossed into unjustifiable brutality. But he acknowledged that these mechanisms were not perfect, that humans still struggled with controlling their violent potential, that every generation faced anew the challenge of teaching young humans to be strong without being cruel, protective without being possessive, willing to fight without being eager to do so. Ambassador Webb concluded by addressing the practical aspects of council membership, demonstrating that humans had thought seriously about what joining would mean beyond the symbolic acceptance of their status as Deathworlders. He outlined proposals for human participation in council initiatives, offered to host exchange programs where young members of different species could learn from each other's survival strategies, suggested research collaborations that could advance all members' understanding of how to maintain psychological health in populations shaped by hostile environments. These proposals demonstrated that humans saw the Council as an opportunity for genuine cooperation rather than merely a prestigious designation to claim. The Council's deliberation took longer than usual, and the human delegation waited with a patience that several members noted approvingly. When Thrix finally called the council back to order, his body language had shifted in ways that Okonkwo recognized as acceptance rather than challenge. The Kresh leader announced that after extensive discussion and careful consideration of all evidence presented, the Deathworld Council had reached a decision regarding humanity's petition. The vote had not been unanimous. Several members had expressed reservations that would need to be addressed through ongoing dialogue, but a sufficient majority had been convinced that humans met the criteria and understood the responsibilities that membership entailed. Humanity was hereby admitted to the Deathworld Council as full members, Thrix declared, with all the rights and obligations that status conveyed. But he emphasized that this admission came with expectations that humans needed to understand clearly. The blood on their colony ships had demonstrated their capacity for necessary violence. Their testimony had demonstrated understanding of the wisdom needed to control that capacity. But true proof would come through their actions in the years ahead. The Council would be watching to see how humans exercised their power, whether they maintained the balance they claimed to understand, whether they proved worthy of the trust being extended to them. Okonkwo accepted these terms on behalf of humanity, acknowledging that words alone could not prove their worthiness, but expressing confidence that human actions would demonstrate their commitment to the principles the Council represented. She thanked the Council for their consideration and promised that humans would honor the responsibility they were accepting, would prove themselves worthy allies to the galaxy's other Deathworld species, would help maintain the standards that protected everyone from the darkest potentials that hostile evolution could create. The formal ceremony concluded with traditional gestures of respect from each species, physical actions that carried meanings deeper than words could convey, acknowledgement from one apex predator to others that they recognized and accepted each other as equals. As the human delegation prepared to depart the council chamber, Thrix approached Okonkwo one final time, speaking in tones that the translation system indicated were intended for her ears alone. He told her that the Kresh had seen something in the footage from the colony ships that had ultimately convinced him to support humanity's admission, something beyond the violence itself. He had seen humans protecting each other, sacrificing themselves for others, maintaining their social bonds even in the chaos of combat. This, he said, was what separated Deathworlders from monsters, the ability to remain connected to each other and to the values that made civilization worth preserving, even when circumstances demanded terrible actions. The Kresh leader shared a piece of wisdom that his own species had learned through painful experience, a truth that he hoped would help humanity avoid some of the mistakes his people had made. The real danger for Deathworld species was not that they would be too violent, he explained, but that they would become too comfortable with violence, would begin to see it as a first solution rather than a last resort, would forget that the protective instincts that made them deadly when necessary could become predatory if not constantly maintained. The Council existed to help members remember this distinction, to provide community and support when the weight of being dangerous became too heavy to bear alone. Okonkwo thanked Thrix for his wisdom and shared a piece of human philosophy in return, a saying that summarized humanity's approach to the balance he had described. "Walk softly, but carry a big stick." It meant, she explained, that humans aspired to be gentle in their interactions, peaceful in their intentions, cooperative in their relationships, but always capable of defending themselves and others when threatened. It meant maintaining the capacity for violence while hoping never to need it, being prepared for war while working toward peace. Thrix's translated response indicated